and welcome to the San Francisco Historical Society's January presentation. We're glad you could join us. Tonight's presentation is streaming live from the East Coast. Our guest speaker is Rick Lank, author, researcher, and storyteller. Rick will be telling a story that few of us know about. Every history buff knows the name of William T. Sherman, Union general who led the March to the Sea during the Civil War. But few people know that Sherman, as a young Army man, lived in San Francisco during the gold rush, first dealing with mining disputes and then becoming a bank manager at the Lucas and Turner Banking House on Montgomery Street, which still stands today. Rick will let us experience gold rush San Francisco through the eyes of a young William Sherman, who arrived in California in 1847 at the age of 27. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit them to questions@sfhistory.org. At the end of the presentation, SFHS staff member Chris Griffith will be on hand to read your questions so that Rick can respond. We hope you enjoyed the show.
William Tecumseh Sherman. Every Civil War history buff knows General Sherman as the Union commander who made Georgia howl. He's also remembered, not always affectionately, for burning Atlanta and Columbia, South Carolina, and capturing nearby Savannah, Georgia, December 1864. And along the way, he became affectionately known as Uncle Billy to his 60,000 bummers on his march to the sea. But did you know that Uncle Billy was a banker long before he was a Union general? He arrives in California, Monterey to be exact, in 1847 after being at sea for 200 days, leaving New York. He experiences the gold rush firsthand, up close. He stays in Yerba Buena, which became San Francisco, and Monterey, where the Army had its headquarters. He becomes a banker at Lucas Turner Bank in 1853. So, well before Sherman's Atlanta campaign in 1864, there was his San Francisco gold rush experience in the 1840s and 1850s. Sherman was only 26 years old when he left New York and 27 when he rolled into Monterey. He had signed up for a 3-year stint in the Army, and the whole purpose of being there was to basically arbitrate discussions and feuds between Mexico and America, because California at that time was not a state, and people were staking claims to gold and quicksilver. So 200 men hopped onto a ship out of the New York harbor and spent 200 days around Cape Horn to get to San Francisco, which was a very tiny, very remote place at the time. However, he thought Monterey was absolutely spectacular. And these are his exact words. Words will not describe the beauty of this perfect harbor, nor the delightful feeling after a long voyage of its fragrant airs and the entire contrast between all things there and what we had left behind in New York. Now, one of the very first impressions of this place called Yerba Buena, it had only 400 people living there. And it's worth noting that in just a few years, there would be 25,000. But anyway, these 400 were largely from the Sandwich Islands, which was what Hawaii was known as at the time. His particular impression of the place was it was incredibly desolate. And he also had an experience on a horseback, which I will share with you. Lieutenant Stanley, U.S. Navy, and I rode into Yerba Buena together on horseback, and there was nothing but a path from the mission into town, deep and heavy with drift sand. My horse could hardly drag one foot after the other by the time we reached the old Hudson Bay Company's trading post. Now, the first land development scheme, which would result in San Francisco, was put forward by a Navy guy back in the middle of 1847, and Sherman rejected the offer. I'm sure he's regretted that his whole life. Back in 1847, a group of men surveyed the tiny hamlet of Yerba Buena and laid out a small area and began selling lots, which were being sold for $16 per square yard. Sherman said, verbatim, "Captain Folsom, your quartermaster, got his clerks, orderlies, and others to buy lots, and for a small consideration conveyed them back to him, so he nominally was the owner of a good many lots. Many naval officers had also invested, and Captain Folsom advised me to buy some, but I felt actually insulted that he should think of me such a fool to pay money for property in such a horrid place as Yerba Buena, especially ridiculing him for what became Happy Valley in common slang, and then later became San Francisco. If he had bought the land early, he probably would have been a multimillionaire long before." Now, he had a very fortuitous meeting with a guy whose name was Henry Turner back in 47. And this is a little story about how a change of underwear can change your life. Henry Turner was a very war-weary Army veteran who had been through the Mexican-American War. And he met Sherman, who basically was part of the quartermaster team. And he gave Turner a change of underwear, and that changed the future for Sherman. Turner of St. Louis, Missouri, would look to Sherman up later in New Orleans in 1852, and he offered him a substantial position as the branch manager of the Lucas and Turner Banking Company to be established in downtown San Francisco. So it pays to be nice to somebody. 5 years later, they had made such an impression, he wanted him to be his manager. Now, in between 1847 and 1849, Sherman was down in Yerba Buena quite often. He visited the Hudson Bay Trading Company, which now is roughly where Market and Commercial Streets are. At the time, way back then, it was basically Bayside property. Hudson Bay went under in 1846 or 7, and there was a little boarding house there, and some of the men stayed there from time to time. His Captain Folsom, who was in on the land deal, was the quartermaster for his crew. And this is the custom house in San Francisco at the plaza, the Yerba Buena Plaza, where they had their custom house and where the quartermaster set up shop. This place was burned to the ground during a later fire. Now, a lot of people wonder, how do you get into San Francisco by water at that time, or Yerba Buena? Because there was just a small cove that was used a lot, and large ships couldn't even get in there, so people were building some wharves. In this case, he described the following: the Clay Street Wharf and the origins of Battery Street. Now, Sherman said, and I quote, "At the foot of Clay Street was a small wharf, which small boats could reach at high tide, but the principal landing place where some stones had fallen into the water, about where Broadway now intersects with Battery Street, and on a steep bluff above, where the original landing place was. The Navy had excavated it during the year before, created a small shelf, and wherein they were mounted a couple of Navy guns, styled the Battery, which I suppose gave the name to the street. Of course, now there's not a single trace of any such thing. In 1848, Yerba Buena becomes San Francisco. It's a long story as to how that might have happened, but according to Sherman, in his memoirs, the founder of the Alta California newspaper, which became a big deal out there, a Dr. Semple, moved to Yerba Buena and, quote, foreseeing the growth of a great city somewhere on the bay, he selected Carquinez Straits, and he bought a title to the land from a General Vallejo, bearing the name of Vallejo's wife, Francisca. This sparked a lot of concern among the main merchants of Yerba Buena. They were afraid that that name would take some thunder away from the little tiny town of Yerba Buena, which was becoming known as San Francisco. So they called a meeting of the town council, and in no time flat, they branded the little town San Francisco in the middle of 1848. And that caused Semple to get very angry, and he changed the name of the town from Francisca to Benicia, which is still in San Francisco Bay, still thriving today, but it never became another San Francisco. It never became the Queen of the Pacific. Now, also in the spring of 1848, that's when the gold rush kind of started, from scratch. And Sherman was actually there at the very, very beginning. I mean, the very beginning. So he had the first sight of placer gold while on duty at the governor's office. Two guys came in the door one day, asked to see the governor, and they had some gold in their hand. And, well, quite frankly, hardly anyone had seen it. Now, Sherman, well, he said, it is authentic, it's real. These guys, he told the governor that they want to create basically a claim. And the governor and Sherman said, well, we can't at the moment, we cannot issue a claim because we don't own the land. California is not a state yet. Anyway, the bottom line, these men had come in from Sutter's Mill. And the governor took the matter quite seriously. And eventually they planned a little trip out to Sutter's Mill with Sherman in tow. Now, I bring that up to you because I want to describe how important the placer gold was. That's panning for gold. That's stuff that's on the surface. It's stuff that's mostly in streams. And anybody that can buy a pickaxe, a pan, some kind of a little saucer like you see there, they can find gold with a very, very low cost of getting into the game. So hundreds of people ultimately would join in. But it all began way back in the middle of 1848 when Sherman was able to put his eyes on placer gold with the governor for the very, very first time. Now, he, at first was kind of wary of the whole thing. He had been looking at mining claims that the Mexicans had, mostly for quicksilver, which was very valuable and very important. Gold, well, they knew a little bit about it, but no one at that time thought it was that unique, that special. But anyway, they organized a party. They took several men, several days to get out to the Sierra Nevada mountain. And they heard on the way of men earning $50, $500, even thousands of dollars a day. And I, Sherman, could not escape the infection. He too got gold rush fever early on. Now, it's important to note that it wasn't until 49 that gold rush is in its full tilt. And there's a group that became organized at that time called the California Pioneers. And only people that were in California at the time, 1849, and had panned for gold were allowed to become a member of the California Pioneers. Sherman was a member in good standing and remained so for years, becoming the treasurer in 1854. Now, eventually, after 1849, his duty comes to an end, that 3-year stint of his with the Army. It's 1850, and he heads home, somewhat reluctantly, to Ohio, where he's about to be wedded to a woman from a prestigious family by the name of Ellen B. Ewing. And it just so happens that her father was the United States Secretary of State. And when they held a wedding, it was not a little country affair. It was in Washington, D.C. It was May 1st, and President Zachary Taylor attended the wedding. That is pretty extraordinary. In the meantime, back in San Francisco, California becomes the 31st state in September of 1850. The government is concerned about all the different kinds of gold that is being minted and printed into coin and used as gold dust. So they open an assay office in California, San Francisco, California. And in 1852, the Congress of the United States authorizes a branch mint to be built in San Francisco. That doesn't happen until 1854, but that's an extraordinarily important event. Now, it's important, I think, to look at what the changes that took place from 1850 to when Billy returned in 1853 as a married man. We have a lot of memoirs that we dug up of contemporaries of Sherman who were there in 1850, who also were pioneers, or 49ers, as they were called. And what was so remarkable is that there were huge fires that occurred in the 1850s, 51 especially, which completely changed and transfigured the landscape that Sherman had known. This is a picture, by the way, of Montgomery Street, one of the earliest known at the time. In Montgomery, it was in 1850, give or take. I have a little quote about Montgomery Street in the early days that Sherman recalled later when he wrote his memoirs. This was his impression. This is what he remembered. Montgomery Street was, as now, the business street, extending from Jackson to Sacramento Streets. The water of the bay leaving barely enough room for a few houses on the east side, and the public warehouses were on a sandy beach about where the Bank of California now stands, near the intersection of Sansom and California Streets. Along Montgomery Street were the stores of Howard and Mellis, Frank Ward, Sherman and Ruckett, Ross and Company, and others. Around the what was once the Yerba Buena Plaza were a few houses, among them the City Hotel and the Federal Custom House. There were single-story adobe homes with tiled roofs, and they were by far the most substantial and best houses in the place. Then we dug up another quote from a book that was called The Summer of 1850, another 49er. The man who admits that he never saw the tide halfway across Montgomery at the corner of Jackson, which is where Sherman ultimately had his bank, who has not walked on sidewalks made of Virginia's finest tobacco, well, they weren't among the pioneering 49ers. Sherman did see the time when the waters from the cove lapped against Montgomery Street, and when he returned in 1853, the landscape he experienced was vastly different, and we'll get to that. Now, there's a real story here. All this happened when Sherman was away, and this is what transfigured his old town. There were huge, catastrophic fires that swept through the city, which was mostly all wood, and it also burned every one of 700 ships in the cove down to the waterline. There are two major fires, and it just completely wiped out large parts of the town. And so when Sherman came back, not only was it different, but the town in 1852 had filled everything in with tons of sand, creating a whole new landscape, and the city sprawled out into areas that had once been a bay, once been a cove. Now, back to Sherman for a minute. In 1852, he is transferred by the Army to New Orleans, Louisiana. He's in the Army Commissary Department, and what happens is he's minding his own business one day, and Henry Turner, the guy who got underwear and clean shirts from Sherman in 47, showed up on his doorstep and said, we've been thinking about you a lot, me and my partner, James Lucas, and we decided that we're going to open up a new branch bank in San Francisco, and we want you to be the branch manager. Sherman had no experience in banking, but he impressed these men because he did so many negotiations and the arbitration surrounding money, gold, silver, quicksilver, and he accepted the position, but only after paying a special visit out to San Francisco in 1853. Now, what happened from there, Henry, who was the senior to Sherman, almost a mentor, he started the bank out there on Montgomery Street. It was a rental property at first. It was across the street from a really busy area called the Parrott Building, which housed many banks, including Wells Fargo and the Adams Express, and the place was bustling. Sherman thought this was a tremendous opportunity. So we wanted to tell you a little tiny bit about this Lucas and Turner and Company. It's based really in St. Louis, Missouri. That's its home. And that's where they started. The company there was called Lucas and Turner Banking House. And when they came into California, they just simply called it Lucas Turner. And this was a very important change in the whole way that Sherman saw himself and saw San Francisco. When he came back in 1853, it was April. Things were looking very, very busy, very prosperous. Well, he had a less than perfect beginning. The steamship he was on, coming around from Panama, it floundered. It was the steamship Lewis in shallow water. No one was hurt outside of the bay. And he remembered that forever, his experience, the first time he wanted to go back. April 9th, he's soaking wet, scrounges for ways to get back into San Francisco. But when he gets there, he finds that the place is just remarkable. Okay, now Sherman, when he finally got to shore and got to see this great little location, which was bustling, unlike anything he'd seen in 1850, here's what his impressions were. And this is a quote. At the time of my arrival, in April of '53, San Francisco was on the top wave of speculation and prosperity. Major Turner of Lucas and Turner had rented at $600 per month the office formerly used and then owned by Adams and Company, which is based to this day in Baltimore, Maryland, on the east side of Montgomery Street between Sacramento and California streets. R.R. Nisbet was the active partner, and James Riley was the teller. Already the Bank of Lucas, Turner and Company was established in San Francisco and was engaged in selling bills of exchange, receiving deposits, and loaning money at 3% per month. Turner and I had rooms at Mrs. Ross's and took our meals at restaurants downtown, mostly at a Frenchman's named Martin on the southwest corner of Montgomery and California streets. He loves what he saw. He is smitten by it. And he goes back home in July of '53. It takes about 4 weeks just to do that, by the way. He tells his wife and his family and friends and army buddies that he wants to go to California. He submits a letter of resignation to his Army commission, and that becomes effective in September of '53. He has by then not only his wife, but he's got a little infant daughter, and he has to take with him a nursemaid. So he makes it there. He is more than thrilled. It takes them, again, weeks to return to San Francisco. They rent a little place, which they're very happy with. And it takes a while for Ellen to get used to it. And it's a pretty, it's a rough town. Even then, with all the development, the ratio of men to women might have been, 8-to-1? So, there wasn't a lot of women who thought a lot like Ellen there in town. So let me introduce you to some of the neighbors that Sherman and Lucas Turner had. There were a lot of assayers, a lot of expressmen. Those are guys who brought gold in from the fields back into town to either the mint or to be assayed to turn into coin. Some of the big names were Kellogg and Humbert down at 108 Montgomery Street, S. Molitor and Company at 410 Montgomery, which is very close to Sherman, E. Just and Company at 104 Montgomery, Curtis, Perry and Ward, which ran the U.S. Assay Office under contract to the U.S. Mint, and the famous Adams and Company Express Office. And here you see a whole raft of very interesting images. There's the gold brick that were commonly stamped individually by Kellogg and Humbert and others, E. Just. And these bricks were then sent back to New York as payment for loans that the banks had made. And this is the only way that great amounts of money were transferred readily through those gold bricks. You can also see that there was a great company very close to Sherman called Barry and Patton Whiskey, known as the Great Tonic of San Francisco. And there's a nice ad, fine wines and liquors, gin and brandy, wine and liquor. That's the mainstay of Barry and Patton. Now, during that period of time, he also got to know several big shots in town, big players. As a banker, naturally, that would happen. The first guy was Cornelius Garrison. Now, this guy, he became a big shot. He was the mayor for a year, 1853 to 54, while Sherman was building his bank. There was honest Harry Meigs, and there were several other characters, but we'll talk about Cornelius first. Oftentimes you hear glowing things about guys who are big bankers, big shots, ultimately gave birth to the Bank of California. But Sherman said, "You ask me in confidence about Garrison? I have seen a good deal of him and can unquestionably state that he is a very unsafe man. He is vigorous, violent, unscrupulous. If I were associated with him, I could not sleep." There was Lewis McLean. There are a couple of spellings for his name that you can see there. He ran Wells Fargo and Company at the time. And Sherman said, Lewis McLean is now at the head of Wells Fargo and Company. He and Parrott and Ing, but they are now cautious, timid, prudent men. McLean contends that having no commissions to pay in New York, unlike others, and insurance at only 1%, he can afford to ship gold at only 3%. And he even offers me to ship our treasure at less, but I would not trust him. Their losses have been awful. Another one of the big shots, a very controversial guy, his name was Honest Harry Meigs. Yeah, he was quite a mover and shaker. He borrowed a lot of money from a lot of banks, had some very lucrative contracts to build San Francisco after the fires. But the problem is he overextended himself. His ambitions got the better of him, and eventually he was not able to pay back some of those loans. In time, as I'll explain later, the whole gold rush started to slow down. As a matter of fact, by 1855, it had slowed down quite a bit. So everybody was depending on the income from the gold. It started to slacken off. Rents started to depreciate or go down. Real estate was no longer worth what everyone thought. And this particular fella, well, Henry owed Sherman, his bank, a lot of dough. And Sherman characterized it as the great Meigs failure, swindle, forgery, and flight, having all the details of the perfect crime. He had been incorruptible, honest, and daring, but unfortunately, again, things went in the wrong direction for him. And he tried to flee. He did flee San Francisco on October 8th of 1854, leaving Sherman's bank and many others holding the bag. And he arrived apparently so poor that he had to pawn many valuables down in Peru. But he got back on his feet, made millions, and left a lot of people holding the bag back in San Francisco. And he never came back to America. The last guy that I'd like to just share more about with you was this fellow, Henry Turner, Sherman's friend, mentor, and employer. He did fight in the Mexican-American War, and it's worth noting that Sherman is the only major general in the Union Army who never did fight in the Mexican-American War. He was in the Army, and as we've discussed, he helped to take care of disputes about mining, but he never had to fire a shot. Turner was very much a soldier and was very wary when they first met. So the impression that Sherman's kindness and generosity made on a war-weary Turner back in 47 was really important and had unbelievable long-term consequences for Sherman, because he got into the banking business, which otherwise he never would have. And then even when things went bad for the banking business A little bit later in the 1850s, Turner and the partner, James Lucas, they continued to offer different opportunities to Sherman outside of the banking business. So this guy was true blue, and they remained friends for many years. Now, after Sherman was in town for a while, getting his feet wet, getting his family established, he was put to the task of building a whole building to house the Lucas, Turner and Company Bank, not just renting a little flat. We're talking building. And building in Jackson Square, which is the 800 block. And I bring that up because, again, up until 1850, that was basically waterfront property. And old-timers remembered, well, guys that are 5 years ago, remember that the water would actually lap up into Jackson Square before these major fires, before all the tons of sand were moved and filled in Yerba Buena Cove. So, in late 53 and early 54, Sherman was authorized to spend, I think it was about $50,000, which is a lot of dough today, about 25 times as much, to select the location of the bank and oversee its design and construction. At that point, his buddy, his mentor, Henry Turner, had gone back to St. Louis, leaving Sherman to run the show. So he chose 804 Montgomery Street. He built the building that you can see in this picture. At the time, it was 3 stories. It's worth noting that the building is still there in the historic district called the Jackson Square District. And it's now only 2 stories high because in the earthquake of 1906, it was damaged severely on the 3rd floor. Now it's a 2-story building, but it still stands. It was built really well. One of the things I learned, I think, through the Maritime Museum is that part of that building and many others downtown used timber that came from some of the wrecked ships that were hurt, damaged, destroyed, or abandoned back in 1850 and 1851. So that ancient building, built in 1853, 54, actually has parts of deconstructed ships that help with the construction, putting it together. The other thing that was really interesting about this place was he was building this incredible structure on what had been water, and that's a lot of sand, so they had to put pilings, 96 pilings in the ground before they could put that kind of weight, for holding that kind of construction. And other huge buildings were to follow, as you all know. The financial district right now is built on what used to be Yerba Buena Cove long ago. And the contractors were given until July 1st, 1854 to complete all the construction on the 1st floor so they could get to the banking business, move out of their rented space, and move into the new building. And the rest of the building, the 2nd and 3rd floors, were all rented. And that was very important for the bank to have that additional rental income. Now, one other observation, though, that Sherman made is I then thought in early 1854 that all of the heavy business would remain toward the foot of Broadway and Jackson Street because there were the deepest and best wharves. But in this I made a mistake, for the city has drifted in the opposite direction, developing out toward Market Street. Yet another very auspicious thing for the city of San Francisco was that the U.S. Branch Mint opened very close to where Sherman had his bank, and that opened in 1854, just as Sherman was getting going. He built his building. It was open in 54, and lo and behold, the federal government builds a spectacular mint, and they start churning out gold coins. Now, there had been a lot of private mints, which we'll get into, prior to this time, but there was so much gold pouring in that the private assayers were just shipping blocks of gold back to New York through Panama, but there was no coinage to speak of by the United States circulating in California until now. So they produced the very first government-issued gold coins, mostly $20 gold coins, like you see here. They slowly phased out the active business of private minters, of which there were at least 25 minting coins. Many had the authority of the United States. Some were just independents. But anyway, there was a whole lot of different kinds of coinage, and there was nobody until the assay office opened to determine whether the coins that were being produced outside of our mint, the U.S. mint, were they authentic? Well, there were a lot of counterfeits, where some kind of shaving off some gold and kind of passing something that was only 90% of value. Yeah, that happened. Now, the mint began printing and minting coins at 608 Commercial Street, just west of Montgomery Street. And it just so happens that the San Francisco Historic Society, for whom we're talking right now, also coincidentally shares this historic address with the original mint. And in these pictures, you can see a lithograph of the mint as it was in 1854 and a contemporary photograph of the same building, which has now been kind of enveloped in other greater high-rise buildings. In the next picture, you'll see a minting operation in San Francisco. This is where they literally are producing the coins, and it's called the rolling and cutting room. It's important to know about this process. It was a very sophisticated way to produce coins. Mostly the $20 gold pieces were for transactions between banks, both on the West Coast and the East Coast. And in just 2 years, that mint had produced $59 million in gold coins, most of which were double eagles, which are the $20 gold pieces that you've seen. Now, there were a lot of other coins and currency floating around that all people had to accept. All of it was what they call legal tender. There were private minters, as we've discussed. There were tokens that could be exchanged at stores or saloons. There was gold dust, which was a very popular way of doing business. And there was scrip, which is paper money, not backed by the U.S. government, by the business or bank that issued the paper. And here you can see a beautiful miner's bank of savings from Alta, California, that has redeemable in gold dust at their bank. You see a beautiful token here that shows a sailing ship for one of the many merchants that were very popular and used all the wharves in San Francisco to transact a lot of business. And there you see a very beautiful coin by another private minter from 1849. NGN were the initials of the little firm. This was a full weight of gold. They had no alloys added to it like now gold coins have 10% copper added. This was pure gold, a half eagle, 1849, at the peak of the gold rush. And then finally, in the gold and silver and coinage department, we've got what used to be called miners' counters. They were kind of used as poker chips in the old gambling halls in San Francisco. Now, you'll notice that's a way that you can, these did not have a great deal of face value, numismatic value, but you'll notice at the bottom, each and every one has a picture of a man just panning for gold. He's got his shovel, he's got his sluice, and his 1849 is stamped on there. So these were really great collectible items that came right out of the height of the gold rush and were used in many of the gambling halls in San Francisco. Now, we've got girls, we've got gold, well, we've got plenty of girls, and we've got plenty of fandango. Yeah, San Francisco both celebrated and cursed its saloons, its gambling halls, and other devilish diversions. And Sherman himself, well, he had a take on it, and then I'll read you another very unusual little description of fandango. In April of 1854, Billy Sherman said, "The City Council of San Francisco have by ordinance abolished fandango, dancing, and bawdy houses, and now you can walk DuPont which is now Grant Street for U.S. Grant, Jackson and Pacific Streets by day and night, without seeing any of those scenes which made them such a disgrace to the city. The more fashionable places on Washington Street are now as silent as, probably as illegible, probably as the grave, and you do not now see troops of girls displaying themselves on horseback and carriages. Such women cannot be changed or reformed, yet their practices are hidden out of the way. The city both celebrated and cursed its saloons, its gambling halls, and other devilish diversions. I got a quote here from The Land of Gold, Fiction and Reality, published in 1855, not by Billy Sherman. There are women who are chaste only for want of the opportunity to be otherwise. They fulfill their shameful destiny everywhere, and California only ripens their depravity a little earlier. Others who hail from the East, where women are hedged in by a healthy public opinion, guarded by jealous laws, and flattered into chastity, while when arriving in California, however, these restraints are all removed, and public opinion in California aligns itself with vice. Other gambling and dance halls, there were many, many, many places in town. They came and they went, but there are three that are worth at least mentioning. The biggest and most famous of all was the Bella Union, known by some as the Temple of Chance. It was built during the height of the 49ers. It was built in 1849 as a gambling palace, and it evolved in the 1850s into what was then known as a melodeon, where, quote, full bearded miners drank their libations and sobbed great tears into their cups as they listened to the trials and heart-rending tribulations of a fellow named Paul Dombey. Now, this gambling hall was built on the site of the old Colonnade Hotel. It was on the north side of Washington Street near Kearny, and from 1893 on, it was a waxworks. Gambling was gone, and a penny arcade. It burned to the ground in the 1906 earthquake. There's another place was called the Blue Dove. It was a politician's haven. There was the El Dorado, also very, very well known for its fandango. There are many others, rough around the edges. A lot of people didn't go there that were not the rough and tumble type. Let's just put it that way. And in all of these establishments, pinches of gold dust were the currency of the day. Before all the coins started to be minted, gold dust was universally used. Now, on the personal side of life for Bill Sherman, he adored his son, Willie, who was born in San Francisco in Green Street, Rincon Hill, I believe it was, on June 8th, 1854. And he was always, for lack of a better term, always Sherman's favorite child. And Sherman himself in his notes wrote, "Of all my children, he seemed to be the most precious." And on the right, you'll see a note written by General Sherman during the Civil War, addressed to his son, Master William Sherman, in Lancaster, Ohio. Little Willie had come to visit his father down south during the campaign through Tennessee, and picked up typhoid fever. It was terribly tragic. The child died on the way home, and Sherman never, ever forgave himself in his entire life because he felt he should not have exposed his son, Willie, to the conditions on the battlefield and the camp where there were some, but not a lot, of illnesses going around. Now, Ellen, his wife, that's an interesting situation that he found himself in. Ellen came from, of course, a prestigious family, and she was used to some of the finer things in life. San Francisco was a little rough around the edges. And Sherman wrote, when he wrote back to Turner, that she was perfectly contented with her new home, but still had a very poor opinion of California. He ultimately concluded that his wife and family should return to Ohio to care for her elderly parents. And Sherman resolved to stay, and it takes whatever it takes. He was resolved to stay with Lucas and Turner. It took by ship at least 4 weeks for any one of the Shermans, but especially Ellen, if she was traveling alone or with her children, to make it back home and to visit her older parents. And that was a long, long haul, no matter what, for anybody. Now, this is where it gets colorful in terms of the lifeblood of the city, the wharves and the sea trade. Jackson Street, according to Sherman, in his own words, is now a great thoroughfare to the clipper ship wharves, all lying north on Pacific Street. All of the miners land at either Pacific or Jackson Street. So, although we are at the present end of Montgomery, we are at the end nearest the heaviest business of the country. Every single street ended with a wharf or a pier. And you can see that in these pictures. You can see how there are piers jutting out with ships along Clay, along Jackson, you name it. And the people that owned that real estate, that owned those piers, made money hand over fist. They all collected tariffs on things, goods and services coming and going. So if there was a boom or a bust with gold, it didn't matter if you owned a pier, you were making money coming and going. Now, you can see here, these are actual pictures from the harbors. There were at times hundreds of ships coming in, plying the waters to come on in. Since money was collected on virtually everything coming and going, those that owned those piers, well, they had a money-making machine. According to the price of land that once sold for $50 along the waterfront, soon skyrocketed to some cases $1 million. Now, this high-rise that you see is actually at 343 Sansom Street today. It's a high-rise. It stands where the once famous Hallison's Pier once stood and thrived. Accounts from that time describe the place as being just unbelievably busy, and it's basically where Sacramento Street is today. As recently as the late 1980s, when this building was being overhauled and renovated, more and more relics from the 1850s were unearthed and recovered and are on permanent display today. So, goods, adventurers, and prospectors all poured in on those ships, along with the money from around the world. And just take a moment here, you can take a look at this particular map and this incredible photograph of one of those ships that were being unearthed from underneath what now is dry land where buildings were being built. This is one of hundreds of ships that were abandoned after they were burned to the ground or waterline in 1851. In the map on the left, you can see a little line up across on the upper left-hand side. That's where the original waterline was. And everything you see coming down, those roads, those piers, those all came after 1851. So there's a whole huge section of the town that Sherman was able to then live and experience and design and build his bank that had once been waterfront or underwater. So anyway, foreign coins came in with all these foreign ships, and there were Spanish reals, Mexican reals, Peruvian and Ecuadorian coins, French francs, Spanish pesetas, English crowns, and Asian coinage as well. And it goes on, all of which circulated, all of which was legal, and the banks and the merchants and the saloons had to deal with not just dollars and cents, but a lot of coins that most of us don't have any knowledge of or familiarity with. Okay, now, moving along in time until the late 1854 period into January of 55, before things took a turn for the worse, the neighborhood around Jackson Square improved incredibly. Shortly before the big crash in February of 1855, which was also called Black Friday. And that map above that you can see showing Jackson, Pacific, and several other, Montgomery Street, of course, in the very center. That is all part now of the Jackson Square Historic District, and that is exactly the area in which Sherman's Bank still stands, along with other buildings that have been preserved and somewhat cocooned within the high-rise environment of the financial district and Chinatown. The neighborhood around Lucas and Turner in 1854 was continuing to improve. The new International Hotel on Jackson Street, Montgomery and Kearny was now open, and the Parisian banking house of Pioche, Bayrac and Company had just moved onto the southwest corner of Montgomery and Jackson, basically across the street from Sherman. Page Bacon and Company's new quarters on Battery and Clay Streets were attracting a lot of attention. And right now here you can see a beautiful example of juxtaposition between the old part of town that was preserved, or 1850s, 1860s style, with the high-rises behind it. The Jackson Square Historic District preserves a swath of the 1850s era, nestled among skyscrapers of much more contemporary times. You see on your right the Wells Fargo building, much different structure than it was in 1850, where it's basically a two-story wooden structure. And so it goes. Growing about San Francisco, other visitors that came to town, people that wrote books that we reviewed that were written in the 1850s, had the most glowing reviews of San Francisco in 1854 and 55. This is the very nexus of the California expansion and the promise from the land of gold, reality versus fiction. And this is the quote: "San Francisco, the Queen City of the Pacific, is the grand mart in which all travel, news, capital, business, and in fact, every species of interest or employment that belongs to the state is concentrated, the nucleus around which every plan and project must first be developed before it can receive life, vigor, system, and order. It is the fountainhead of all the tributaries of trade and traffic that flow through the state of California." And then they pay the ultimate compliment: Paris is France and San Francisco is California. Things went decidedly south, slowly but surely, after 1855. Here's what happened. There are troubles and reversals of fortune. Some were controllable, some were mounting for a long time. There were strategies and people depended too much on placer gold, which we'll get into in just a minute. Foreign investors, for one, pulled out. There was a drought, and when you have a drought, you cannot get placer gold. It requires water, and plenty of it, from the streams to process your gold. No water, no gold. We'll get into that later. There were falling rents and property values. They started to slide. And then there was the result, a really big run on the banks, a bank panic in February of 1855. Sherman was on top of the game. He was very cautious. He knew a lot of people in town that owed him money. And so without getting into a lot of detail, and he does in his own memoir, get into some real details about how he sweet-talked, harangued, and wheeled and dealed to get part of a loan repaid that went towards building the Custom House, replacing the one that burned down in 1851. He found someone that basically guaranteed the note, so the bank would release, the mint would release money to him as a sort of prepayment. And the bank was really worried about a big run on Black Friday as it was coming up in late February. And here's how it all played out. He finally cut a deal very late at night, very early in the morning, and to get basically $40,000 in gold coin out of the U.S. Mint in a repayment for the loan that went to the building of the Custom House. $40,000 is the equivalent of $1 million today. He was taking his horse with 2 saddlebags, as you see in the pictures, down Montgomery Street over to the Mint. He picks up 2 bags, each filled with $20,000 in gold coin. He has no armed guard. He's not talking to expressmen like Wells Fargo to protect him. 1 guy, 2 saddlebags, probably 1 pistol, walking his horse down the street with $1 million. He makes it to the bank just in time for the doors to open. People come in. It wasn't as bad as he anticipated for him, but he saved the day for the bank before that run took place. Other businesses failed on Black Friday, including several express companies and 1 or 2 major banks. And he managed to save the day. Anyway, many authors, after Sherman came and went, believed that his resourcefulness and his character was such that he would one day reveal how strong a leader he would become when the Civil War broke out. Further compounding the problem, in 1855 and 56, as we mentioned earlier, there was a drought, a really stubborn, long-lasting drought. You can see here how miners routinely, they have set up sluices, they bring down buckets of soil laden with gold dust and ore. They process it through the sluice, which takes a lot of water, and it takes mercury, by the way. And without water, there's no gold. And that began to really, really exacerbate the problems with the economy. Now, this caused a real reversal of fortune for many, many big shots, people that had been high off the hog just a couple of years before. And Sherman was quoted in 2 ways. A great many here are going through bankruptcy. There must be an immense quantity of dishonesty, for the bankrupts are really living more comfortably than those who pay their way. He also said, he quoted a guy by the name of Martin Burke, that many a clever fellow had been ruined by paying his debts. As 1856 dragged on, prospects dimmed even further, and it got harder and harder to make a buck. As I mentioned, Nicaragua is seized by William Walker and the filibusters, shutting off shipping for a period of time. Panama is swept by riots. And then Sherman becomes a leader in a new movement in San Francisco, calling for a wagon road to Nevada. And the whole purpose there is to let people make it to San Francisco by land rather than by water. Everyone loved sailing and sailing ships back around 1849, 1850, 51, but it was becoming harder and harder to ship gold. There were political troubles that made it impossible to ship through Nicaragua. So he actually got together with 50 other business leaders or more, and they appealed to the state legislature to basically create an interstate road. And on top of that, which I thought was a great idea, they actually suggested drilling wells along the way so there'd be potable water for the animals to drink and for people to nourish themselves with, essentially creating way stations just like today's interstates. The deal didn't work. Later on, the Interstate Railroad came through in Oregon, and the Civil War, of course, diverted a lot of money, manpower, and attention away from ambitious projects like that. But I thought he was way ahead of his time to suggest a truly humane approach to encouraging interstate commerce from Nevada into California. Unfortunately, that one didn't work. So as things got worse and worse for him and the bank started to take losses, he actually said, and I quote, "Don't invest even if $1 would buy all of Montgomery Street." He had been such a huge proponent of California in 54 and 55. By 56, things had looked a lot more bleak. And it was early January of 1857 that he actually received word from headquarters in St. Louis that the San Francisco branch will close down permanently. Okay, epilogue. The Civil War and after. Of course, we all know the history that Sherman became a very famous general. He was admired in the North, he was loathed in the South, and he continued being very active in the Army and helping veterans for the rest of his life. He became active in what was called the Grand Army of the Republic, or the GAR, became quite a leader in that, which helped many, many veterans across the country, fought for the North, of course. He created housing for the homeless and disabled veterans across the country. He returned to San Francisco in 1886 for the 20th encampment of the GAR with Presidents Rutherford B. Hayes and with Clara Barton. This is the way it looked. It's a depiction of that huge assembly of veterans. Some say, 10, 20,000 veterans assembled. Clara Barton, founder of the Red Cross, Mother Mary Bickerdike, company nurse who did a great deal of work with Sherman after the war. Just a phenomenal display of support and love and camaraderie here in San Francisco in 1886. I wanted to read to you one thing that I found in his, it was hard to find some really fitting words to conclude, something that had virtually nothing to do with military, nothing to do with banking. But these were some words of Sherman's that he wrote basically at the end of his life. And it was very sage. I think that it's worth listening to. This is what he advised for anybody at the end of the line in terms of growing old. So live your life that the fear of death can never enter your heart. Trouble no one about their religion. Respect others and their views and demand that they respect yours. Love your life. Perfect your life. Beautify all things in your life. Seek to make your life long and its purpose in the service of your people. Prepare a noble death song for the day when you go over the great divide. So there's my introduction to Uncle Billy as a banker and humanitarian at the end and a philosopher. So I thank you all very much. We'll be working on other sequels to this story, including one that deals with the San Francisco scene during the Civil War itself. So again, on behalf of a great team of people that I'm working with, thank you all very much.
Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Griffith, and I'm with the San Francisco Historical Society. And tonight we have the pleasure of having Rick Lank here with us for a Q&A. Thank you for being here, Rick. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I'd love to answer any questions that come along. So
Great.
fire
So
away.
I'll read what the audience has to say. When Sherman returned to East in 1849, he was replaced as a just adjutant by Lieutenant Colonial Joseph Hooker, and they had no friendship for each other later in the Civil War. Did they interact at all in California?
A great question. I couldn't tell you. I'm certain if it's in his memoirs, which are extensive, the amount of detail that goes into what he did prior to the war is a little thin. I'll be happy to look up the details for your colleague to give an answer to you, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Fantastic. Sherman's memories are incredibly detailed and very accurate as far as can be determined. Did he keep a diary or did he just have an amazing memory?
But that too is an incredible question. I can't. Most of what we know about him is through his letters, and there are extensive collections of the letters, which produced at least one really thorough book, which was a source of ours. It was called William T. Sherman, Gold Rush Banker, published in 1969. But most of those letters, they tended to be, how do I put it, about 70% all about banking and a lot of minutia about banking, about 30% personal, how he felt, his asthma, his wife's unhappiness being in California. There's not a lot of detail. There's certainly nothing that indicates that he had a diary, but I too couldn't imagine how anyone could keep the memoirs that he kept and publish at the end of his life with that kind of detail after what, 40 years had gone by since he had experienced the gold rush. I Beyond my comprehension. So if he had world's first tape recorder, I'd like to know about it, but I have no idea how he pulled it off. And that's as frank as I can be.
Well, you must consider. Very interesting. Thank you. Our next question. Was Sherman's banking career linked to his war career?
Oh, not that I can see. I mean, none of his affiliations, like with Lucas and Turner, had anything to do with his going forward in the war. What happened ultimately was after the bank failed after 1857, um, he went ultimately to Louisiana. And from there, he was, how do I put it? When Louisiana seceded from the Union, he was down there and he had to resign a governor's appointment to run a small military school. And he went back north, packed his bags, joined up with his brother, John Sherman, toured along the Potomac River to look at the defenses along there. And, he didn't become really famous as a military leader until, of course, the March to the Sea. He didn't, for example, have anything to do with the campaign in Gettysburg. So I don't think that San Francisco, there was no connection he made in San Francisco that directly relates to the Civil War, other than the fact that some of the skills that he had as a guy who was good at arbitration and good at trying to settle a score, trying to deal with logistics, probably helped him a great deal later in life.
Rick, why was Sherman's involvement in the gold rush not well known, overshadowed by the Civil War?
Well, I'm hoping to change that a little bit. Even when you read other documents about him, and even this book that I cited that came out in 1969 about his life as a banker, I think the guy was able to quote in the beginning that of all the 20 or 30 major books that were written about Sherman up to that point, um, out of about 1 million words that were published, maybe 10,000 dealt with his life before the Civil War. I don't know why that is, because I find, as you can clearly see, that there was a lot of really exciting things that took place in his life that he witnessed for the first time, like the very first placer gold. I mean, that's not something that happened to everybody that was out there. I mean, he was one of the first people to see gold. He understood mining like no one else. He saw the value of quicksilver, which is mercury, um, being mined in Southern California. Anyway, the point is, I have no idea why it never attracted more attention. And I hope now we can begin to work with you in San Francisco to tell that story a little bit better. There's a lot
Well,
that we had. Yeah, we had to leave a lot on the cutting room floor, by the way. Some of your other comments might be pertinent to this, but I know you mentioned something about the Vigilance Committee. We had a whole section about that. We had to chop it out because there's so much that we didn't have a chance to tell the whole story. So maybe we could have a sequel, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
fantastic. Thank you. No worries. Rick, when did you, as a historian, first become aware of Sherman's involvement in California gold rush? Before his career in the Civil War?
Well, we have been working in the whole money slash numismatic area concerning how money changed the Civil War. A series of books and talks that we've given called Money, Mayhem, and Might. And I bring that up to you because once we started to uncover how that particular war and that particular period of time profoundly changed our money and our banking system going forward, paying for the war, that just caused us to look twice at Sherman and to look at other people whose lives, other parts of their lives that were instrumental in history, but there's such a focus on just that 4 years of war that you don't get to see all the other things that these men and women both contributed to the changes in the world at that time. And everyone knows that the gold rush profoundly changed um, society, period. But there was a huge, how do I put it? A lot of friction and internal squabbling, even about who would control California during the Civil War because the money was so important. Whoever controlled the gold, you could pay for armaments and everything that comes along with maintaining a fighting force. So California was in play, and Sherman, I think, was aware of it, but he never wrote about that very much. But that's been things that we've uncovered as we've gone along.
Thank you, Rick.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on Sherman and John C. Fremont relating to California?
Ah, okay. I have to confess, I don't know very much about John C. Fremont. I know it's mentioned, and I have to confess, it's one area that I don't know very much about. And again, I apologize for not being knowledgeable about every little. I'm not certain to put it in any way. We have so much information that I just couldn't focus on it all, and I apologize.
No worries. Thank you. Um, why didn't Sherman fight in the Mexican War?
Well,
What
that's
was the time? Excuse me. Thank
oh
you.
no, that's right. Well, I don't know clearly why he didn't, but he was already in the service. He uh, was the word I'm thinking of. He was dispatched with a contingent of men to take care of issues in California that arose because of the Mexican American War. There's a part of him I understand that had always wanted to be in that war, to be active in the war. It may have been his relative youthfulness. He was only 26 at the time. He was still in the service, but he just wasn't in the active uh, campaign. I think that the men like Henry Turner, who had fought in that war, were a little bit older than he was at the time that the war broke out.
Interesting. And next question. So I'm viewing this from New York City, the
Ah,
very neighborhood where Sherman lived during the later years of his life.
ah,
I'm one block from Sherman Square, and my daughter attended the William T. Sherman Elementary School. Do
whoa.
you do you know what his exact address was on the Upper West Side?
No, but the answer to another question, though, the statue that commemorates his death that was erected near the, well, yeah, Central Park. I can't remember what side of Central Park, um, by St. Gaudens. I think it was during the era of Teddy Roosevelt. That was a really magnificent structure to celebrate his life, led by Lady Victory. Um, that we've written a bit about, just the fact that someone of the stature of St. Gaudens not only produced that beautiful statuary, but that whole inspiration of Lady Victory is what ultimately became the figure that we see on a $20 gold piece from that period of time. But going back to the question, as asked, I do not know where he lived. People have told me that he frequently saw General Joe Johnston, who, of course, was from the South, from Tennessee, that became good friends and visited each other in New York City. And I understand that Joe Johnston was also a pallbearer at his funeral, which I find quite remarkable since the two of them had to face off with each other. And Johnston surrendered to Sherman April 26th of 1865. And they went on to respect each other very much. Um, Again, I don't know anything about where he actually physically lived at that time.
Thank you, Rich. And we'll head to our last question.
Sure.
Do you have any knowledge about General Sherman's experience, if any, with the Native Americans in the Northern California?
Hmm. Now that I cannot speak to. I've done a lot of research on the mint that was authorized in the Civil War in the Dalles, Oregon. And that had a hell of a story because that was a major trading post in the Northwest. And I mentioned the uh, Hudson Bay traders at the beginning of the story. He was familiar with the Hudson Bay Trading Company. The tokens that they had and used with the fur trade business were found at the graves of many Native Americans um, along the river up there in the Dalles and Portland area. So I have no knowledge of how Sherman interacted with the native population, but we've done a lot of research about the mint that was authorized for the Dalles and the politics surrounding that area at the time, which it was authorized in 1863 or 4, built by 1870, and never struck a single coin. But we we have a book that does cover some of that with the founding of the different mints in the far west and how important the relationship with the Native Americans were in the state of Oregon. But I don't have any knowledge about San Francisco and Sherman.
Thank you, Rick. These are very detail-oriented questions, and we covered a lot. Certainly, it's a wonderful presentation. So I say thank you again for allowing the San Francisco Historical Society to be the platform to display your knowledge and wisdom. So thank you very much again, and thank you to our viewers who are streaming online. Thank you for your donations. We are still accepting donations. They mean a lot. They allow us to continue to do what we do, what we love to do, which is present, protect, and promote San Francisco history. So thank you all again. Have a good evening, and thanks for tuning in.
I thank you too, and have a good night.